بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to another class, another lecture discussion in reading this great book by Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah bil-Usul. We are in book 6, giving preference to proof. And in today's lecture and tomorrow's lecture, it's going to be a little odd because it's basically a drop-down list. He's just going to be he's going to say one gives preference to, and shoot, and he just goes down a list of, I don't know, 30, 40 issues. So one way of doing it is just to read them all and, one after the other in like one class and say, okay, well, you kind of understand. They're self-explanatory. Of course, I'm not going to do that, inshallah. I'm going to try to take them, I'm basically cutting the list in half because I think when you do a list, at least I find that it can be overwhelming. Maybe each individual one is not rocket science. I mean, you take you give preference to the narrator who has more knowledge than the other. I mean, okay, well that kind of makes sense. But it's important that maybe we give some examples, we talk a little bit about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about today's class. The list that we're going to take is really about the type of preference we give to people who narrate information, people who narrate either traditions of the Prophet ﷺ, ahadith, or people who narrate, it's largely the traditions, the ahadith of Rasulullah ﷺ. And this is going to sound like what we talked about in the Mustalah hadith class, in the class of hadith nomenclature, because this is, again, usul al-fiqh, as you can see, it takes from the different sciences. So it takes from logic, it takes from theology, it takes from language. And here it's going to take from the hadith. And we're going to learn about why we are preferring some over the others. And the overarching theme, which is not necessarily explicit in the text, but I want you to understand, is we are very concerned with the quality of the narrator before we are concerned with what is being narrated. So you will see a lot of these qualities have to do with the person themselves. And as long as for us the person is solid and reliable, then therefore we trust that what is coming after them is going to be reliable. That's an important theme that I'll constantly come back to in this class and in tomorrow's class, inshallah. So without further ado, let's begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So we begin the way we always begin, just to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and we turn to the text itself. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. So Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Sorry, I just need to find a right way to place the book in the text I have in front of me because it's a little complicated. Okay. يرجح بكثرة الأدلة. One gives preference to the most proofs. بكثرة الأدلة والرواة في الأصح. One gives preference to the most proofs and narrations in the dominant opinion. So, okay, obviously, when we have somebody who's going to give us more proofs, if someone gives us 5 proofs and another person gives us one proof, we're going to go with the person who has the more proofs, and also the one that has narrated the most. So if somebody who has narrated the most over someone who has narrated less, that means that narrator will tend to be more reliable because they are in the process or in the habit of narrating more. Most of the Sahaba that we have, the narrations of, only narrated a single hadith. So imagine that Sahaba lived his entire life to narrate just one statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And then there are very few of the Sahaba that narrated hundreds of hadith, like Abu Huraira or Abdullah bin Mas'ud or Abdullah bin Abbas radiallahu anhum, all, etc. I mean, you know those famous names, but not all of the Sahaba, even if they're well-known Sahabi radiallahu anhum ajma'in, not all of them, especially the well-known ones, narrated necessarily a lot. Some of them, there was a general sense of fear and awe, not fear, but awe of the Prophet ﷺ, and wanting to follow him and be in the moment rather than to narrate. And then the Ahl al-Safa, the people of the bench, the people like Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu, who dedicated themselves to knowledge. Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu is another one who narrates a lot. They dedicated their lives to this. So it's like a skill set. So obviously that's with the narrations. When it comes to the proof, the more proofs that we have, the more certainty that we're going to have in the ruling. So if somebody is able to address a complicated issue and attack it from many angles and talk about it from many angles, from the linguistic angles, from the theological angles, from the point of view of usul al-fiqh, from the point of view of the illah and defining the illah, so on and so forth, that's going to give us a higher level of certainty in that which is less. So that's sort of the first couplet that we have. And then he says, rahimahullah, وفقه الراوي ولغته ونحوه, the highest chain of transmission. So I'm not going to keep saying we give preference to. That's all this list is, what we're giving preference to. And then the highest chain of transmission, knowledge of fiqh of the narrator and his command of language, etc. So the highest chain of transmission, meaning the shorter transmission. The shorter the chain of transmission, the stronger strength it's going to have from a proof text point of view. In the time of the Salaf, not in the time of the Khalaf. So sometimes as students we make this mistake. Today we see that the longer the sanad, it's like the more barakah that we have, because the sanad exists today for the barakah. Now, if I wanted to narrate Sahih al-Bukhari from me to Imam al-Bukhari radiallahu anhu, I am going to search for the oldest sheikh that has the shortest sanad, so that my sanad is closer or shorter, afwan, to Imam al-Bukhari, also for the barakah. But what I meant to say is that we have a principle in akhlaq and tasawwuf, رُبَّمَا أَخَّرَكَ اللَّهُ لِيُقَدِّمَكَ. Maybe Allah Ta'ala has delayed you to advance you. So we don't see that we have come late as the khalaf as something necessarily bad, but we get to add all of these layers. So today, it's not so much the concern as the shortness of the chain of transmission. Here we're talking about the time of tadween, the time when the hadith were put together. And then knowledge of fiqh of the narrator. So the narrator's knowledge is very important. If the narrator is a faqih or afqah, or more of a faqih than another narrator, that's going to give us a lot of more reliability, because not only is the person narrating information, but the person understands what they're narrating. And therein lies another distinction that we oftentimes forget to make. Not everybody who narrates is going to be up to the level of knowledge of what they narrate. And there's a hadith to that effect, رُبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهٍ, how does the hadith go? Well, I can't remember the exact wording of it, but somebody who narrates the hadith or carries the hadith might be less knowledgeable than the person to whom they're going to narrate it to. So carrying a tradition, carrying a narration, of memorizing a tradition, for example, is not the same as understanding that tradition. That's why we have ilm al-riwaya wa ilm al-diraya. So in this case, we're looking at the fiqh knowledge of the narrator themselves. And then the command of language, etc., and related things. So the person who is narrating the hadith, if they have a command, their command of the language of the narration, which is the Arabic language, the more intense that is, great that is, sophisticated that is, nuanced that is, the more trust that we're going to have in that person's narration. So you see, right now we're already talking about people and the quality of people, and that's sort of a theme that I want you to keep in mind. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَوَرَعِهِ وَضَبْطِهِ وَفِتْنَتِهِ, his scrupulousness, precision, and intelligence. So, wara'ihi, his scrupulousness, is somebody's wara in their personal practice. And one of the great examples of wara that we have from our madhab is Imam al-Nawawi, who heard that the fruits of Damascus were placed in a waqf for the poor, and therefore he did not want to eat from it. He only ate from the food that his mother made from him in Nawa and delivered to him, periodically. This is an act of wara. Just, I want to be scrupulous. I want to be careful not to engage in something that's haram. So that quality is important, because the person who does that in their personal life, not to show off, but the person who that's how they live their life, chances are a lot higher that they're going to be equally and doubly scrupulous, or even more, when it comes to narrating the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, or a piece of information or a piece of knowledge. Because if they're that meticulous when it comes to the food that they eat and the company that they keep, how about how they would be with that which is even greater than that, which are the statements of Allah Ta'ala Almighty and His Prophet ﷺ. Udabtihi, precision. Ufitnatihi, his intelligence. So the person who can narrate more precise is preferred over the one who can't. Some people narrate bil ma'na, by meaning. And that's where you get a little bit of the variances in the hadith traditions, versus somebody who narrates verbatim. So we prefer the verbatim narration. The narration bil ma'na, by meaning, is acceptable in certain circumstances, but it's not preferred, right? We prefer that which is verbatim. And then the intelligence, so the natural intelligence of the narrator. وَإِنْ رُوِيَ الْمَرْجُوحُ بِاللَّفْظِ, even if he narrates the less preferable opinion, the marjuh, verbatim. So we always want to transmit and follow. So we always want to follow the rajah, the more preferred. So there's the rajah and there's the marjuh. There's the more preferred and the lesser preferred. There are instances where we will follow the lesser preferred, the marjuh, and we kind of interpret it as like a difference of opinion. So even if such a person narrates the marjuh, the less preferable opinion verbatim, we are going to take that over somebody who narrates something else that is not verbatim. So here, the quality that we are preferring is the verbatim quality of the narration, not the non-verbatim quality. So if I transmit something to you based on my interpretation of it, I've already injected like a part of doubt in that, because it's my interpretation in that. My interpretation could be wrong. But if I'm just reporting to you exactly what I heard and saw, like an eyewitness type of thing, verbatim, this is exactly what I heard, that's going to obviously be more preferred. So even if the person, he says, even وَإِنْ رُوِيَ الْمَرْجُوحٌ بِاللَّفْظِ, even if they narrate the lesser preferable opinion verbatim. Meaning over the preferred opinion that is narrated by meaning, not verbatim. So here, what's the quality? The quality is the verbatim quality will always be given a preference. And then he says, وَيَقَظَتِهِ وَعَدَمْ بِدْعَتِهِ, and his alertness and lack of innovation. So the alertness of the narrator is that the narrator is astute and alert and aware to everything that's happening regarding that which they're narrating. We're running out of time. We'll stop here, pick it up in the next clip, inshallah. The last clip, we ended with this statement from this part of the text, وَيَقَظَتِهِ وَعَدَمْ بِدَعَتِهِ, and the narrator's alertness and lack of innovation. So the alertness, al-yaqadha, which actually in the books of tasawwuf they call, that's like the first step, of the path, is to be awake, to be alert that there's taklif and jannah and nar and dunya and akhir and all that kind of stuff. So is the person aware? The more aware the person is, the aware of the details, the time in which they live, the issues at hand, so on so forth. The person that has more of that is going to be preferred over the person that doesn't have more of that, and of course the person that has the lack of bid'ah. So unfortunately, in every time and age, there are people of bid'ah and there are beliefs of bid'ah. So this is where you will find, when you get into the signs of jarh and ta'dil, or the criticism of the narrators, a lot of the narrators will be criticized and critiqued because of their bid'ah. Whether the bid'ah be bid'ah of in the early time, the Kharijism, you'll find narrators that are critiqued for their extreme views in Tashayyu', which sometimes spills over to just anyone who is accused of being a Shia, even though just that person loved Ahlul Bayt. I mean, Imam Shafi'i was accused of being a Shia because of his love of Ahlul Bayt. So I mean, that's obviously ridiculous. But here we're talking about the extreme Shia, the Shia that will curse the other companions, and that dark stuff. That person is going to be critiqued versus a narrator who doesn't do that. Also, there are the narrators that held beliefs of bid'ah beliefs of i'tizal, the Mu'tazilite views of the createdness of the Quran and whatnot. Or there might be somebody that has some philosophical leanings and follows some of the peripatetic philosophers, like the qidam al-alam, the eternality of the world and things like that. So people that have bid'ah, they're always going to be critiqued and open to critique, obviously, on these matters. Now, when we talked about hadith nomenclature that does not necessarily not let us accept the person's narration, but we will not accept that narration if their narration has to do with that which they have bid'ah in. So if somebody, for example, if somebody believed in the createdness of the Quran, and then they have like 3, 4, 5 traditions that they narrate about the createdness of the Quran. Okay, well that's what, as we say in English today, that's a conflict of interest. So, but if they had, if they narrated something completely different, like something that has to do with raqa'iq, like if you say this dua, like this thing happens, you get this much reward. I mean, that's a little bit easier to accept because it doesn't have to do with their bid'ah. Anyway, so we're always going to look for the person that does not have a bid'ah and that is as close and assiduous a follower of the Quran and Sunnah as possible. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَشُهْرَةِ عَدَالَتِهِ, his fame and uprightness. So they are known to be upright. They're known to be an idle narrator. And that's a reputation, right? And in the formative period, that stuff was very important. I mean, reputation is still important today, but people lie all the time in social media, so it's kind of deep fakes and AI and all that kind of stuff. So now it means the way we would manifest uprightness is a little bit different. Here at this time, it's like, no, Sheikh Fulan, we know this is an upright person. They've dedicated their life. They're consistent in their worship. They avoided all of the fitnas of their age. They avoided the bid'ah of their age. They lived a scholarly, ascetic life, so on and so forth. That person is known. So now, when we say something like, Abu Hanifa or Imam Malik or Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal radiallahu anhu, or Abdullah ibn Ahmed, the son of Abdullah Ahmed ibn Hanbal, or Imam al-Shafi'i, or al-Buwisi, or al-Muzin, man, these people are khalas. Their adala is way known. I mean, beyond reproach. Their characters beyond reproach. And when we hear their name is a hujjah. So when you hear Imam Shafi'i said such and such, even if you don't follow the Shafi'i madhab, you're going to listen to what he says. Because why? Because his reputation is beyond reproach. That's what he's taught. That's how you give preference. So that's how preference is established at the time, and then layers of authority are established over time. وَكَوْنِهِ مُزَكِّي بِالْإِخْتِبَارِ, and that he is praised by being tested. So not tested like we set up a trap for them, but tested and time and tested, tried and tested rather. So the person is known. I mean, this person was teaching in the Kufa mosque for 20, 30 years. Khalas, I mean, they're tested. We know what we're going to get, and the person is known. He taught consistently 365 days a year, or let's say 360 days a year, to avoid the ayat and things like that, for like 20, 30 years. I mean, that person, what more do you want from that person? That's an ayah. That's an ayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have that consistency. By the way, in the books of tasawwuf, they talk about, I'm mentioning tasawwuf a lot because a lot of this has to do with like kind of personal character. They talk in the books of tasawwuf about, what is the greatest miracle, right? The greatest miracle is to be consistent. To be able to do something consistently 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, that's a sign that the person is a saint. Okay, I got to pick up the speed a little bit. أو أكثر مزكين, or he is praised often. Okay, so that's another way. ومعروف النسب قيل ومشهوره. His lineage is known, and some say by fame. So we know the lineage of a person. They're from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, or from the descendant from Abu Bakr ibn Siddiq radiallahu anhu, or something, or Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, or some like noble lineage, or they are known to have that lineage. So when it comes to lineage, of course, the more verification we have, the better. But there are just families that have been generation after generation after generation known that they are descendants or of the Prophet ﷺ's family or something like that, and it's mashhur. They're known like that. And then in the modern age, a lot of these families will have, there are many families that will be like Al-Qadiri or Al-Jilani or something like that, and they're descendant of Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani. It doesn't mean that they have to show you like a certificate with like a stamp and seal, but it's just they're known for that lineage, and therefore that's going to be preferred over somebody of no lineage. وصريح التزكية على الحكم بشهادته. A clear statement of praise of him. والعمل بروايته, and using his narrations. So if we have somewhere documented in the books of Jarh wa Ta'dil a clear statement that Fulan is a reliable person, so if Dhahabi says something like that, or Ibn Hajar Asqalani says something positive about the person, that's going to be a preferred person. Or maybe that's not stated that way, but everybody takes from that person's narration. So if everybody that we rely that's famous takes from their narration, then that person is going to be solid, and which is kind of how we do takhrij. So like al-mustadrakat, al-istidrak, like al-Hakim's mustadrak, like on the Sahih collections. But he's saying, well, Bukhari used these people in narration, and I found another hadith using these people that he didn't catalog. So we say that's also at the level of Sahih al-Bukhari. An example that comes to mind is the hadith of التوسع يوم العاشوراء من وسع على نفسه وأهله يوم عاشوراء وسع الله عليه سائر سنته. Whoever expands on themselves and their family on the day of Ashura, Allah Ta'ala will expand on them the rest of the year. Imam Sheikh Ahmed ibn Sadiq al-Ghumari radiallahu anhu, he has a little risala on that hadith, and he showed that it is one of its pathways is the people of Sahih Muslim. It's Sahih ala Shart Muslim. So that's kind of what he's saying here. That's the istidrak is a extension of what he's saying, an extension in the hadith manifestation. Here we're talking, of course, about law, but you kind of get the idea that okay, maybe the person's not mentioned, but people use their hadith. So if they use their narrations, therefore that person is going to be preferred over somebody whose narrations are not used. And then he says, وَحِفْظِ مَرْوِيٍّ, the memorization and narration, وَذِكْرِ السَّبَبِ, and mentioning the causes. So the hafiz, the person who is a hafiz of hadith, their narrations are going to be advanced over the written form, which will come in a little bit, because the written form is more prone to mistakes because you can add and subtract. But when you memorize something, memory, it's there, it's in your heart. You've like memorized it. Like if you've memorized, your address, or but somebody, if you're telling somebody on the phone, your address is such and such, that person might mistakenly write it down. It happens all the time. And digits are copied, or the name of a street or road or boulevard or lane or whatever, or country or city might be kind of miscatalogued. Let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace. I realize I'm going a lot slower than I originally thought. Maybe I should have done even less, but we'll keep going. With dhikr sababi, mentioning the causes. So when the narrator mentions a cause, like why this incident happened or something like that, that's obviously going to be preferred over one who doesn't mention the cause. And then he says, وَالتَّعْوِيلِ عَلَى الْحِفْظِ دُونَ الْكِتَابَةِ, one who relies on memory over one who relies on writing. Somebody who grew up in the West, we're used to looking things up. It's not a memory-focused society, and I didn't really understand the weakness in that until I went to Egypt and I started studying Sharia and stuff like that. And I was around people who all they did was memorize, just in normal life. I'm always like, where's the piece of paper in my pocket? Look at the address. So I learned the importance of memory and how memory is like a muscle. So whether you're memorizing the Quran or the Hadith or text or whatever, the more you train that, the more your memory increases, and then it's more reliable than the written form. Excuse me. And then when you get into the books, like the book that I'm teaching from you is, I have this critical edition of the text that we're studying that has a lot of nice footnotes. There's another couple of versions out there. This is the one that I just happen to be using, and you find mistakes. In the printed work, you find mistakes. My own teachers, I studied with them, and in their books that are printed in their lifetime, there are mistakes. So it's always, the memory is always going to be more reliable over the written format. وَظُهُورِ طَرِيقِ رِوَايَتِهِ, his chain of narration is clear. There's no majahil, there's no people that are unknown, or there's no moment in the chain of transmission. Well, how did this person meet this person? If this person was like in Al-Andalus and this person was, in Mawara al-Nahr, and they only overlap 1 year and there's no known Hajj trip, or you can make up a scenario in which it would be dubiousness. وَسَمَاعِهِ بِلَا حِجَابٍ, his having heard from his sheikh without an intermediary. And that's important. So, as we know from the hadith nomenclature class, the Baiquniyah that we did together, you can receive an ijazah through a letter or a writing or something like that. That's going to be less than when you sit face to face with the sheikh and you hear from the sheikh, obviously. So a narrator who has known to, one of the reasons why we have so much reliability in the teachings of Imam Shafi'i is that Rabi'a sat with Imam Shafi'i and outlived him. I think it was like 50 or 60 years. He died after the passing of Imam Shafi'i. So, he narrated the Risala and the and the books of Imam Shafi'i thousands of times. In one of the stories I think we talked about in the introduction to the Shafi'i Madhab class, there'd be like hundreds of people at his front door. He'd open his door, there'd be like hundreds of people there to listen to him, and all he did the rest of his life is narrate. So, narrating, we know that Rabi'a was the sahib of Imam Shafi'i, one of them, and has the highest narration of the madhab. He's known to be like, we say mulazim. He's necessarily a part of the companionship of Imam Shafi'i versus somebody who we heard came and went. And the next group is going to be obviously controversial. وَكَوْنِهِ ذَكَرًا وَحُرًّا فِي الْأَصَحِ, that he is a man free and free in the dominant opinion. Well, of course, he says in the dominant opinion. So there's a differences of opinion, and the difference of opinion falls in the issue of in matters in which women are experts. So generally speaking, even though this is the opinion that Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah advances, and I'm not going to disagree with him, but in the literature of usul and narration, it is very common to find that in matters that are dealing with women, things only, childbirth, menstruation, and we're going to prefer the opinion and the narration of a woman over a man because they are the people that have direct knowledge of that. We don't. That's why he says it's an dominant opinion. The free over the slave, that is unfortunately just part of life, and the pre-modern world, that was the preference in that situation. وَمِنْ أَكَابِرِ الصَّحَابَةِ, and he is from the senior of the companions radiallahu anhum. So remember, as I said, the companions are not one block of people, but there are older and younger. So the older companions, the companions from way back when that lived through everything, their narration is going to be preferred over the companions who were only children when the Prophet passed to Rafiq al-A'la sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. وَمُتَأَخِرِ الْإِسْلَامِ فِي الْأَصَحِ, the last to become a Muslim, because then their narration is going to be later. So if there was any issue of abrogation or something like that, it would have taken place. This is not necessarily amongst the companions, of course. وَمُتَحَمِّلًا بَعْدَ التَّكْلِيفِ, he who heard after the age of puberty, obviously the narration will be preferred over somebody who only narrated what they saw in puberty, and that narration ended there. And these we've talked about before. وَغَيْرِ مُدَلِّسِ, the one not known to fabricate. Well, obviously, if someone's known to fabricate, we're not going to trust what they have to say. So the non-fabricator obviously will be preferred. So if there is a narrator who is known never to have fabricated, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those type of people, then obviously we're going to prefer their narration over somebody who is, even if they fabricated once, it could taint the whole thing. وَغَيْرِ ذِي إِسْمَيْنِ, one who does not have two names, because then there can be confusion. Do you mean this person or this person? مُبَاشِرًا وَصَاحِبِ الْوَاقِعَةِ, the one who directly narrates, which is kind of similar to what we just said before, so we don't have to comment on that, or the one who was part of the incident being narrated. So many of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ will say, when the Prophet ﷺ married me, versus somebody else said, when the Prophet ﷺ married so-and-so. So which one is more direct? The Prophet's wife, she's saying about herself. It's like the hadith of the age of Sayyidah Aisha alayhi salam. The only narration that we have, to my knowledge, is her own narration. So, obviously we're going to go with what she said. Versus somebody who's narrating about it. So this is a loophole to the man over woman preference, and that's why he said in the dominant opinion, because there are instances in which when a woman narrates, if she's part of the incident, of the part of the story, like many of the stories about marriage and divorce that we have in the hadith literature, that's going to be preferred over somebody who narrates about that issue. Um, وراويا باللفظ, narrating verbatim versus narrating by meaning. That's going to be a stronger narration. We talked about that in the beginning. ولم ينكره الأصل, whose narration is not negated by the original story. So if you narrate and something and you've kind of contradicted yourself, that's not going to be preferred. وفي الصحيحين, the person who narrates from the two Sahih collections, because those are the highest ranked narrators that we have. والقول فالفعل فالتقرير, and then narration of information over action over affirmation. So the speech narrated versus the action that's narrated versus a affirmation, because the speech is going to be a direct, unequivocal thing. The action, it could be, well, maybe you saw this, maybe it was a sunnah, not a fard, that kind of thing. Sorry, I got to pick it up. ويرجح الفصيح وكذا زائد الفصاحة في القول. The person who's more fluent will be preferred, and the fluent person and the person who has more fluency will be preferred over those who have less fluency. والمشتمل على زيادة في الأصح, the one who has more knowledge, obviously, as a narrator. والوارد بلغة قريش, the person who narrates with the language of Quraysh over the person who does not know the language of Quraysh. والمدني, the Madanese over the Meccan, because they came later. والمشعر بعلو شأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, the one who honors the Holy Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم the most, obviously, because then they're going to have more value of what they're narrating. وما فيه الحكم مع العلة, the person who presents the ruling with a ratio legis, because that's always what we're looking for. So the job is done for us. وما قدم فيه ذكرها عليه في الأصح, what was previously been mentioned with its ratio legis, the dominant opinion. وما فيه تهديد أو تأكيد, and that which has a warning or a confirmation to the ruling, because then we have more confirmation over one that doesn't have these things. Okay, so tomorrow's class is going to be just a continuation of the list. I just arbitrarily stopped in this section because of the number of pages, and you can kind of see, as I was saying in the very beginning, what I was trying to communicate to you all is that the issue here is the person. So we haven't even really talked about the text. Some of them are the text, like the illah and things like that, but what we're really after is we're after the person. So one of the things that marks Islam, the Islamic thought paradigm, and the thought paradigm is encapsulated in usul al-fiqh versus other thought paradigms, is we put more stock on the quality of the person first, and then what is being said second. Whereas in other thoughts paradigms, they put the stock on what is said first, and then the person who is saying it. We'll put a pause in it here. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class we began going through the long list of preferences. So what are the type of things we prefer over other things? And as I said in the introductory clip, and as we kind of talked about in the three lecture clips of today's lecture number 9, is that most of them, not all of them, but most of the preferences have to deal with the quality of the person. The person that is more upright, that has a better memory, that narrated verbatim, that actually met the sheikh, that didn't know not to have any bid'ah, that honored the Prophet ﷺ, that was fluent, so on and so forth. It's the quality of the person. And that's, again, another indication why tasawwuf and akhlaq and tazkiyah is an integral part of usul al-fiqh and an integral part of the being of the mujtahid, which is, as I mentioned, and probably you're sick of me saying it, is how the book concludes, because it is an essential part of being able to do this task, this great task of making or doing ijtihad. There are some things here that have to do with the text, the text that's more clear, that's verbatim versus unclear. And all of these we've visited in some way, shape, or form before, when we talked about the hadith nomenclature, when we did the Bayquniyya together. And this also reminds us that usul al-fiqh takes from the other sciences and adds flavor to it that is the usuli flavor. So some of the discussion here, while it looks the same, it's not going to be exactly the same, because here we're talking about giving preference over one piece of information or one proof text versus another, not necessarily with verifying the veracity or the strength or the grade of the hadith, which is a more narrow, that's not I don't mean that in a pejorative way, it's a more specific task that the muhaddith does. Here we have a broader task, which is, you know, we have a whole host of tools in front of us and adillah and proofs. Which one are we going to prefer over the other? I do think that a lot of this is intuitive. By now you should kind of understand these things, but hopefully some of the examples that I gave and some of the stories that I gave, and you know, sometimes I go off on tangents, I apologize. Hopefully that will kind of give you a sense of an understanding of the specifics. I need you to know the specifics, of course, that's why we're doing the course, but I want you to know the general, I really want you to comprehend this general concept that it's the person, the quality of the person is what we put preference on first and foremost before we consider any of the other things. We'll end there. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.